connected to audio. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. While folks continue to join, we'll go ahead and get started with some introductions and some housekeeping. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Abra Lyons-Warren. I'm the Director of Cross-Sector Initiatives here at CLAPA. That's how we pronounce that acronym. We're so glad that you can join us today. Before we hop into today's exciting webinar, just a couple quick announcements and reminders. So if you did not receive an email about it, our proposal application for sessions at our annual summit is open. Applications are due December 1st. So we will put a link to more information for that in the chat, but invite all of you to send us your great and wonderful ideas. Looking around, I see numerous past presenters joining us today, so pleased to have you. I would love to hear what you all are up to in your communities. Otherwise, I think we can also drop a link to our webinar calendar. The next one will be next month. And so far, we've had a really great start to the year. And I think, Camille, any other sort of pressing announcements from our end?
You know, I'm not sure if we made the announcement last month, but the dates for the Housing Is Summit is May 9th and 10th. So save the date. I'm also dropping in the link to our Housing Is Summit website, and we will update more information there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yes, we very much hope that everyone can join us. It'll be back in DC at the beginning of May, and registration will most likely launch in January, but keep an eye on your inboxes, and you can always feel free to reach out to us with any questions. Great. So with that, we are recording today's session. So if you want to share with colleagues after the fact, if you would like to revisit any information that you hear today, we will follow up with a link to that. We have really great attendance so far, and I see some folks are still trickling in. So really excited for you all to join us today. We are going to be talking about trauma-informed housing. We're going to first hear from POAH, that's the Preservation of Affordable Housing, talking about their toolkit, as well as giving us some level setting and definitions around this important topic. And then we're going to hear from a partner with the Denver Housing Authority, sort of giving us a case study example on the ground. So I will let each of our speakers introduce themselves further, and then I'll just say what we're going to do today is let them do their presentations, and then we'll do Q&A at the end. We do have a couple polls happening today, so if you're kind of more listening, you know, maybe turn to your screen to see if there's a poll for you to participate in. And you do not have to hold questions till the end. If you don't want to forget it, you can go ahead and put it in the chat, and Camille and I will make sure that we come back to those at the end. So I think with that, Juliana, do you want to introduce yourself further? Is she frozen?
She is frozen. So let's just give her a quick second. Oh, bad timing. She was working so well a minute ago.
Yeah.
Oh, she might need to be logging back in.
Sure. Her first poll, was that supposed to be a kickoff? Should we do that?
Yes. So I can go ahead and launch the poll just while she's getting logged back in. These are just some brief questions. Make sure you scroll down to help our presenters understand who's on the call and what your familiarity with the topic is. Julianna did say that she was on site at a YMCA today for an event, so she might have some spottier internet, but she should be jumping back on.
So while we're waiting for her to rejoin, if you have not filled out the poll, go ahead and do that. I think also,
There we go.
oh, there she is. That's perfect. Thanks everyone for your patience. We jinxed ourselves. We were talking about how smooth.
My goodness, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So sorry, everyone. I am on a guest Wi-Fi network, and I guess it asks you to re-up every hour. I really apologize for that. So thank you for giving me a little bit of grace there. Yeah, you would think 4 years into this, we would be smooth sailing. But Abra, should I take it from here?
Yes, and just the only thing is, while we were waiting for you to, we knew you were getting back in, we did go ahead and launch the initial poll. So whenever you're ready for us to share those results, we can do that.
Yeah, sure, that'd be great. Awesome. Great. So hi, everyone. I'm really sorry about that. I'm Julianna Stuart-Lomax. I'm with POAH. We are a nonprofit owner and operator, and we've been a fan of Kalafa's work and membership for years, and just really grateful to be able to join you today, share a little bit about what we're up to, and hopefully have a little bit of conversation as well. So thanks for answering the poll. It's always really helpful to understand where folks are coming from. Looks like we have really great representation from resident services and some of the executive folks and other, which is great. And if you feel like sharing in the chat where you're calling from and what you represent, that's always helpful. And so we were also curious how familiar folks are with trauma-informed care and trauma-informed housing. And no surprise, a lot of folks were very familiar or somewhat familiar, absolutely expected that. And looking forward to hearing more from all of you as well. And then really interested in this question about where your organizations are in their trauma-informed journey. And there's quite a mix, and it looks like we have some experts who are doing this very robustly. So I really hope that you'll consider chiming in as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and take a second to pull up my slides into slideshow mode. Maybe a thumbs up if folks can see it. Great. Awesome. So I'm going to talk for maybe like 15-20 minutes if I'm any good at keeping time, and share with you a little bit about our journey as an organization that is trying to kind of lean into and adopt this across our work, and tell you a little bit about how we did that, what our journey has been to be trauma-informed while becoming trauma-informed, and some of the things that we're putting into practice. Here's a little bit of a roadmap for our session, and I will try to give you as many examples as possible, but I'm sure many folks on this call know that becoming and being trauma-informed looks like a lot of different things. So there's a lot of stuff we could talk about, and I will probably only scratch the surface. So we're a nonprofit owner and operator, and this is our mission. And you know, I think just a little bit about our journey here. We were looking at trauma-informed care from a resident services perspective. That's the part of the work that I come from, for a number of years, and felt like we kind of kept hitting this wall, training staff on a method and then sending them back into a work environment where nothing else was really changing. And so in 2020, we were very privileged to receive a large grant that allowed us to adopt this and spend a lot of time on this. And without that, we probably wouldn't be this far along. That being said, and I'm sure many of you know, this work doesn't have to be more expensive. So the idea is not that you need a big grant to do trauma-informed work, but that certainly helped our organization get started. So we're primarily working in the Northeast, Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, and Florida. That's where most of our communities are, and we own and manage just over 13,000 homes. And we're really kind of a full service developer management company service provider. So we do a little bit of everything, and we're trying to think about how this trauma-informed approach should get integrated in every part of our business, which I'll talk a little bit about. So I know we have a lot of experts here, so I'll just touch briefly on this relationship that we're really continuing to try to understand between trauma and housing, which is very multifaceted. And there are probably also a lot of folks here who are doing this work and maybe using a different term or not calling it, but doing it in your work. And so I just want to acknowledge that as well. You know, trauma-informed care is this thing that came out of healthcare that we felt was really relevant to the work we do in housing. We're working with people in a very vulnerable place in their home. But, you know, a lot of the principles that I'll share are person-centered or are very well aligned with other practices. So just to do some basic level setting, I like to offer what I think of as a very plain language definition of trauma. This is language that our residents and staff came up with. I'm actually here in Chicago doing a training with our staff, and you know, we just want to make this terminology as relevant as possible. And so for us, it's a personal negative experience. It's just too much to handle. It you know, traumatization is when the resources we have are just not enough to cope with a threat. And we know that it's pervasive across the United States, doesn't discriminate, and that if left unaddressed, trauma can have a really lasting impact. And I always love to pair that definition with this one from Resmaa Menakem, who is an amazing therapist, healer, author. And it reminds us that trauma is a tool of survival. It's really it's not a flaw or weakness. It's how our bodies are designed to respond to threats, whether they're real or perceived again. And so I really want to like linger on the idea of perception, something we might perceive as potentially dangerous. Because we might perceive that the work that we're doing to provide homes and to manage them, to HUD rules and standards, or to deliver resident services, we perceive that as being a good thing. Doesn't mean it can also be perceived as potentially harmful or threatening by others. So perception is super important, trauma informed work. And we no two people experience something the same way. And so we just, again, try to sort of keep that in mind. So what I'm offering here is kind of just a way of thinking about the very multifaceted relationship between trauma and housing. And so often I think in our public discourse, increasingly talking about the impact of trauma, which is important as we're all experiencing it, it's impacting our lives. We talk about what's going on in sort of childhood household. Wait, I found laser pointer. I just discovered this feature. So over here, we tend to kind of think about individual experiences and therefore sort of individualized response. So, you know, in the housing context, that might be overcrowding. It might be just having a precarious housing situation. It might be financial burden, kind of individual family level. But what we really also want to do is widen the lens. What are the ways that properties themselves or property level can either contribute to or exacerbate trauma, and whether that's mismanagement or unhealthy conditions within homes that can lead to or trigger trauma. We also obviously want to think about the climate. You know, we work a lot in Florida, for example, and storms and increasingly severe storms themselves can impact a community and can cause trauma in a community, but also like that reminder, that trigger, like it may happen again, it may come again this year, it might remind me of one in the past. And obviously where our housing is, how resilient it is, our systems in place to support people after a natural disaster can also have an impact. And then at the community and system level, you know, thinking about things like gentrification, larger scale forces when we work at the neighborhood level, what is or is not available in the community, how it's invested in, how it's policed. Like all of these things are connected to the experience that our residents and staff are having that can either kind of, again, cause or exacerbate or support resilience and healing. So, you know, historically, I think from the resident services space, we were learning about trauma-informed care, thinking about it as a very interpersonal method of supporting folks. But I think where we are now and where I think the field is going is we really got to widen the lens and think about what are the other ways that our work as developers, owners, management companies, neighbors are maybe intersecting with other forms of trauma or can be contributing to other forms of resilience. And now I'm going to try to get rid of the laser pointer because now it's getting difficult. Okay. So for those who are familiar, there's lots of ways of thinking about how to respond, right? So trauma-informed care, there's lots of different sets of principles. I always learned a lot from Sansa's principles. This felt relevant to us. So where we landed after working with residents and staff in our organization was these are sort of the sets of principles that we want to apply across our work to be trauma-informed. You can read more about these at our toolkit. I'll drop a link in the chat. But what's important to mention here is just that safety is foundational. You don't get to the other ones if we don't secure safety, and that's physical safety, psychological safety. So safety is foundational, but all of these are important. And as we are becoming a trauma-informed organization, these are sort of the commitments that we're making. So again, you can read more about this on our website. But it's really shifting the perspective from, you know, what's wrong with you or what happened to you. That's the primary question in trauma-informed care, right? It's about valuing lived experiences, expertise. It's about changing culture. But as we all know, changing culture on its own is really, really hard, especially in a big organization. And that takes tactics and concrete operational things. So that's what we'll move on to a little bit next. So I just want to tell you a little bit how we did this process, because you know, it's not something that we believe should be or can be top down, because being top down is not very trauma informed, right? So if we're establishing safety, we're being collaborative and we're offering choice, then the process by which we say what in our organization needs to change or how can we become and support more resilience, then we need to do that in a way that models those behaviors. So we had some really fantastic partners that we worked really intentionally with for about 12 to 18 months. And we essentially followed like a human-centered design type process. They called it co-design, we've been calling it co-design, but essentially like starting with big important questions, like what do we know about the problems we're trying to solve? Going out and learning. And so we picked 4 pilot locations across our portfolio that we felt like were representative. So we had large suburban campus, we had scattered site in an urban setting, and both of those were over 750 units in each location. Then we had a couple smaller properties, suburban, urban, more like campus, kind of traditional multifamily, maybe 150 to 250 units. So felt like we had a sampling, we had geographic diversity. So at those sites, teams of residents and staff went out and they did a lot of community-based research. They talked to their neighbors, they did focus groups, and they brought it all back. And so together we sort of synthesized it together with them and said, well, what did we learn about resilience and healing and artificial barriers that we're creating in the housing experience? Like, what do we learn about how we can become more trauma-informed? And we sort of processed that together. And then we moved into brainstorming or ideations, like, okay, now that we've learned all this, how do we want to respond? What would it look like for POAH to support resilience and healing, to become a trauma-informed organization? And then where we are still doing a lot of work around this idea of prototyping. Hey, we learned a lot, we have these great ideas, but like, do those ideas actually address the problems that folks surfaced? Do they have merit? And so that's sort of been the kind of general process. And now we're sort of more at scaling things that seem to be working. Sounds very linear, but in reality, it looks a little bit more like this. It's a little bit messier, especially the kind of like early learning. And some stages you got to bounce back to other stages. But that's essentially the process that we followed. At its core, it's all about designing with community, whether that's designing a physical space, whether it's designing a programming, whether it's a program for residents, whether it's designing programs for staff. It's just really about designing with, not just for community. And so out of all of that, we identified these 7 sort of like cross-cutting themes. These are opportunity areas that came from these very diverse pilot sites, and we started to hear a lot of the same things in these very diverse locations. And again, you can read more about each of these on our toolkit, but we sort of want to offer them up as like, this is what we also think is relevant, you know, here now in 2023 in the space where we work, and maybe also some of it resonates with your community. So found these opportunity areas. Some of them were things that we needed to focus on specifically for frontline staff. Some were things that we needed to focus on for residents. And some, there was a lot of sort of interplay between both. And And then our teams went out and tested them out, did some prototypes. So for example, up here, this is a community that wanted to focus on physical spaces that were about to be renovated. This is a basketball court, very iconic at this property. They were going to move it, totally rebuild it. The staff was like, this is going to be great for them. And part of their prototype was around like resident leadership and feedback. And they did a pop-up event, and the residents said, absolutely do not move this basketball court. Like, it's nice that you want to fix it, but its location and its presence are really meaningful in this community. It'd be very disruptive if you moved it. Great example of prototyping, challenging some assumptions. This is one of our communities in Boston. They felt like they really wanted to just lean into healing and creating spaces for healing. So they did a lot of workshops with staff and residents around meditation, mindfulness, yoga, like all that yummy stuff. And there was a lot of learning that came out of that as well. And there were a lot of assumptions that came out of that. Lots of resident programming focused approaches that are kind of more in that like straightforward trauma-informed healing. Folks in our Cincinnati team said, we are totally overloading residents when they move in. There is no possible way they could understand all the rules and expectations. And then 90 to 120 days later, they're getting a lease violation for something they didn't even know was a rule. We need to reimagine that experience. So they started prototyping these what they're calling now is a welcome home program. It's sort of like a gamified resident orientation. It's released in different doses, started doing videos and new materials, and that's kind of been a spin-off that we've been building on as well. And then here's another site. They really wanted to focus on resident leadership and programming. They had a lot of great ideas for programs. They said, hey, we'll have them be resident run. And one of their big learnings was residents are not interested in the ideas that we're interested in. And we have had this assumption challenge, and we need to kind of go back to the drawing board. So sometimes in prototyping, you fail, and that's a good thing. We celebrate failure because now we're not pursuing an idea that doesn't have merit. So hopefully this gives you examples of like, hey, you do this co-design process, you follow the community, you follow what they're interested in. And in doing that, there are these lessons that we can kind of apply to other locations. But what also came out of that is there are a lot of things folks want to see that are totally outside of the scope of the day-to-day work of the staff that we need to change at an organizational or institutional level. So on the left, rules and policies reimagined. We heard so much about how rules and policies need to change, and much of that is not within the sphere of influence of frontline staff and needs to be the responsibility. We need to hear their feedback and their expertise, but we need to make changes in other parts of the organization. We also heard a lot about how folks want to see the physical space sort of reimagined. And you can see accessible renovations. There's a lot of themes and intersections around like, what does it truly mean for a space to be accessible? Trauma-informed accessibility have a lot of alignment and overlap. And we felt like, okay, there's also a lot of ideas here that we need to take up and adopt as an organization. So that's where we're going to kind of move now. So putting that into practice, we kind of did this 12 to 18 month intensive co-design process. We did all these different prototypes, try to test things out. What does it like to kind of do this as an organization at scale? So, you know, we're an owner and operator, and we do manage what we own. We own what we manage. Typically, we have a management company within our organization. So just for context, we are also the management company. So these are the 4 buckets of work in our organization where we're trying to apply a trauma-informed lens. So the first is in development and design. So the places and the spaces and the role that the community plays in designing them. In property and asset management, there is so much we can do around policies and procedures. I will just point out one of our big learnings was that every kind of rule or policy that was creating a lot of friction, not everyone, but a lot of rules and policies that were creating a lot of friction, a lot of things around like lease renewal and recertification. Staff said, can't do that, it's HUD rule, can't change it, it's a HUD rule. We did not find a lot of things on the books that said that these are actually HUD rules. It was a lot more of like an inspector came out 20 years ago and said that this was a thing, so now it's become standard practice. Or someone who worked here 15 years ago thought that this was the HUD rule, but it's not actually anywhere on paper. So now we're really also kind of fighting this uphill battle of like, wow, we thought we could just go down a policy route, but now we actually have to change the hearts and minds of people in our organization and help them think about maybe doing some things differently that we've been doing the same way for 30 years. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. Resident services, focusing on some changes to programs and services. And then I can't stress this enough, but I'm sure folks here experience it. The well-being of frontline staff was like one of the most important things that I think was elevated for us in this process. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing there. And I'm going to try and move really quickly. So a few things to touch on in development and design. There are these amazing trauma-informed design tactics. You're going to hear some really cool stuff from Chad about what this looks like in the built environment. But trauma-informed design is also about the engagement and the role that folks play in the process of imagining their community. So a couple things we've been doing, we've been really trying to tighten up our project mission writing kind of practice. If something is in bold and italics, it's like a tool that we have. And if it's not, it's more like a kind of culture building thing we're trying to do or something that we're trying to kind of establish. But project mission writing, like being very concrete about what our goals are. We have a skinny mission during the acquisitions process, and then it gets built out over time as community is engaged. So it's flexible, but it has to be articulated and it has to be written down somewhere, especially if staff change on a project. Transparent budgeting workshops with residents, being really inclusive about decision making, trying to get sort of to the root of things. For example, we're doing redevelopment in Miami. Everybody wants a pool. We can't afford a pool, but also talking more. It was like, okay, well, do we really need kid spaces that are safe? Do we need a water feature? Like, how do we get closer to the root of this thing? And then being really, really communicative, and particularly in large scale redevelopment projects where there's a lot of misinformation and there's some money that needs to go into that piece. I think that was a big learning for us. We actually have to put a little bit of money behind that. And then if you go onto our toolkit, you'll see some resources that we created around design. We have a design guide that's instructional. It's meant for like architects, GCs, people who we need to understand our values around this, who are going to help us kind of realize it, but also educating new staff as they come on. We have a project manager checklist, so we're sort of baking in these key moments in their in the development process. And then also POAH has this website called Basis of Design. It's historically been specs. So like if you're going to buy cabinets, here's the cabinets we want you to buy, here's the HVAC system we want you to use. And now we're working on kind of integrating and overlaying trauma-informed into that. So that again, like people who work for us to help realize projects are also educated about this. And in the interest of time, I'll skip some of this. It's in our toolkit. It's a design guide. So definitely go check it out. So around property management. So I mentioned we're the management company, and there was a lot that residents and staff wanted to see changed around rules and policies. Probably no surprise to anyone here, income certs is probably the biggest one, leasing in the certification process. And also it turns out the things that are frustrating for residents are also really frustrating for staff. And so, you know, we're moving to online research, and we're also trying to work with the team to do that, to say, how do we make sure this is really user-friendly? Because if online research are stressful, we're not going to solve this problem of the administrative burden and time and in-office visits and lost paperwork that we're having. And so the goal there is really to increase transparency, increase efficiency, and improve that process in a lot of different ways. Talked a little bit about our Welcome Home program. So we're just kind of trying out different ways of better educating residents about all the amazing and complicated things that are in their lease. So plain language materials, lots of visuals, lots of tools. So, you know, created like this Candyland map. It's like, here's what it looks like to go through your annual lease renewal process. We spent a lot of time figuring out like, what are the 8 most common things that people get a lease violation for within their first year of living with us that are really high stakes, and make sure those are the things we put front and center when they move in, rather than kind of burying them among all the other stuff that's in their lease. We have been rewriting all of our resident facing notices. That's been a really heavy lift, but it's really, really, really helpful. And I'll just say here, like, one of the things that's been really helpful is focusing on critical incidents, how to communicate with the community after something happens. And staff often look to us and are like, well, I didn't think I could share any information. And then residents were telling us, well, we feel in the dark. We don't know what's going on. So we felt like we needed to give people a lot more structure around how to communicate about incidents. Leases and house rules, I talked a little bit about that. A lot of that is like increasing transparency. We tried to do some testing around writing house rules like at the building level. That didn't work very well, I will say. But we are trying to think about how we write house rules with community and maybe reframe them as well. I'll talk about frontline staff and well-being. And with physical inspections, we are, from a policy perspective, trying to encourage a reduction in duplicate unnecessary inspections, like from investors, where, you know, there's just a lot of foot traffic in units. Sometimes it's really short notice, and that can cause a lot of stress. We also are now doing those as a team, resident services and property management, which has been a huge improvement, I think. And then on resident services, speaking as a resident services person, it's very proud of the work that we do. We felt like we needed to recenter residents in our resident services. There were still a lot of services that were based on assumption, based on what partners the staff had they didn't want to let go of, and there were not a lot of spaces for residents to be really taking the lead and really informing. And so I think the co-design process was really helpful. We're continuing to prototype. So right now we're doing a lot of prototyping around mental health. Again, like, we can have great feedback and great ideas, but sometimes those ideas don't work as intended. So constantly going back and getting feedback is really important. Paid positions, I think, has been a really great programmatic shift for us. So more resident ambassadors for program-specific initiatives, like our financial health programs. There's resident ambassadors for each of the individual programs. And then for the co-design work, we created this fellowship, and all of those are stipended. So setting aside a little bit of money to pay residents for those kinds of things has been really helpful. We formed a resident advisory board. This was new for POAH. There wasn't anything similar. It's a national board, so that's been really helpful for us. They've met with department heads and they give feedback, they ask questions. So that's still emerging. That's been a really great programmatic shift. And then I always have to call, there's just not enough funding for services. And that was also a big theme. So we're asking a lot of frontline staff to do really heroic things with very few resources. So, you know, continuing to advocate for that, advocate for flexibility. You can find some training resources on our website as well. I won't get into this today, but I think also shifting how we measure, what we measure, how we measure for transformative change. In addition to some of those outputs and operational metrics that we want to see change, we expect to see a positive improvement on property financial performance and resident stability. But what does it look like to measure the culture change that will support long-term change and resident success as well? And just for the interest of time, I won't go into this in a ton of detail, but I'm also happy to talk more about how we're thinking about acute mental health. This is a big part of being trauma-informed. We are an organization that needs to learn and grow a lot. So right now we're really in the develop clear protocol space, where we're prototyping our protocol, which I know probably sounds excessive, but it's been really helpful because a lot of the feedback from staff is like, this is a really risky thing for me to get involved in certain situations. I have a lot of fear around getting too involved. I don't know who to go to for help. I don't want to look like I can't do my job. So we sort of want to deconstruct some of that to make sure our protocol are really clear and very safe for staff. And the last thing I get really excited about is staff experience and well-being. There is such an important relationship to the well-being of staff, between the well-being of staff and the well-being of residents. So something we're working on right now, we launched a peer care team. So it's a peer support program among staff. Peer care team responders are deployed after a critical incident in a property, just to say, hey, I'm here. I heard something happened. I have your job too. I know this can be really hard. Do you want to talk about it? And by the way, did you know we have all of these resources in HR? So it's also meant to be a bridge to the company's existing resources that are not being utilized. And that's a model that came out of a hospital setting that we learned from. It's really like reducing some of the stigma around asking for help. It's not always comfortable to ask your supervisor for help. And so that's been a really powerful test for us as well. So I'm going to actually wrap here. You know, there are some things that we did to become a trauma-informed organization. I hope you'll check out our toolkit. You can find literally like the agendas we used in the co-design process, the activities we did, some case studies, our training tools. And I hope you'll consider dropping your email in so that we can stay in touch about this work as well. So I'm going to stop sharing there and turn it over to Chad.
All right, that was fun and great to see Julianna. I've never seen you present, so it's kind of cool to. I mean, I know we co-present on stuff all the time, but cool to see what you're up to. My name is Chad Holtzinger. I'm with Shopworks Architecture, and we do a lot of housing design work and various weird programming type, non-profity type, non-residential work, which includes shelter or service areas or things like that. Just whatever you can imagine. We've kind of worked on it over the last decade or so. So I'm going to talk to you about a project that we just opened for the Denver Housing Authority called Thrive. Let's see if this works. Does that look all right? All right, good. We similar to Julianna, we've been working on trauma-informed design specifically as it relates to design of buildings earnestly since 2015 or 2016. Over the years, we've interviewed close to 2,000 building users, 50 or more sites, and lots of training. We put together a framework. This is available on our website, shopworksarch.com. There's a bunch of resources and webinars that you can plug into to kind of get into our way of thinking. But as Julianna said, safety is the beginning. And in our framework, the idea of safety being the element that unlocks relationships, that unlocks personal agency, allows somebody to feel comfort. And then all of the externalities of property management, the place in the city, external factors like COVID or neighborhood bias, and know, learn, commit is kind of a process of what do we know, what do we need to learn to do the project well, and then commit to doing that. Our process is organized more around a real estate cadence and a management cadence. But we have similar things to what Julianna was talking about in our kind of suggested process. Vision alignment, really key. Pre-occupancy research. So now that we have an aligned vision on a project, what are we going to learn from people who might be housed here or might work here? And all that needs to happen before we start designing a building, and then post-occupancy research. We go back to everything we design and just really interrogate it. What was our intention? Did it work? Stuff like that. So with that said, Thrive, for those of you who know the Denver Housing Authority, they're really an amazing agency. They've done some really innovative redevelopments over the last 20 years, the Mariposa neighborhood, Park Avenue West, and now Sun Valley. Sun Valley is, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but organized around these red rooftops to the south. Thrive is kind of off campus, but it's in a really important location in the city of Denver. You can see Mile High Stadium just to the north, those red roofs right in front of downtown. That's Auraria campus. So it's a giant higher education campus downtown and all the resources there. Ball Arena is also to the left, big parking lot. There's big redevelopment going on all along the Platte River and the Cherry Creek River, which is nearby, which are alternate modality. And the reason that is really wonderful is that this site is, we're not even talking about transit. We're just talking about proximity. Like you can walk almost anywhere on this photograph. Thrive is a part of a redevelopment of the Sun Valley homes. You can see kind of in the center of this wheel. DHA had worked with the Sun Valley neighborhood to kind of identify core values. So that vision alignment phase, they worked on that for several years. Views to the mountains, what are our historic neighborhoods, the importance of kids and families, the access to transit, the culture, the cultural amenities that are right outside in proximity to downtown, the history of industry in that region. It was a manufacturing, and there's a big energy plant that was decommissioned there recently. And how does that inform what this place ought to be, and the history that we want to remember through the design process. We took a look at building massing. So one really interesting thing about this project is it's 50% of the units are 3, 4, and 5 bedrooms in a 135 unit project. So the bedroom count in 135 units is over 435 units or beds. And some of the families in Sun Valley Homes had families of 13, 14 people living in a 4 or 5 bedroom unit. And so the intensity of the density was really important. And in moving from kind of a horizontally organized neighborhood to a vertically organized neighborhood, it was abundantly clear that we really needed to take the needs of all these little people running around very seriously and create the opportunity for families to have safe places for their children to go that's supervised and visually accessible. And so this diagram, you can kind of see on the right, there's kind of social amenity next to a toddler, kind of young kid playground that's really cool and interesting. Then a basketball court, so the tweens and teens have some place to be. And then, we kind of call this adult swim, the gardening area over to the left, as a concept of just how do you create environments where people can participate in culture to the extent that they want to, or sidle into it to the extent that they're not interested in being extroverted. How do we get kids engaged? There's these stairwells that drop kids right onto the terrace in a safe way from the corridor. So really recognizing that families and kids being in this safe place in an urban place that's a little bit in the middle of nowhere right now, but that in 5 years will be in the heart of everything. There was a lot of community outreach, as Julianna pointed out. DHA, I think, is a really wonderful partner in this way. They had a community center built for a project of this scale. And so there were meetings about once a month regularly, and then there'd be off-kilter meetings. So for instance, the Thrive meetings, would maybe go on to every month or every other week kind of cadence. And we talk about all myriad of things about, what does the building look like? How does it touch the street? What means safe to you? What means safe to your family? What's the history of this place? How are we going to, articulate that in an architectural and urban design expression, and learn from that. This is an image of the built product. You can kind of see how the design manifests itself in real life and the proximity of all the cool stuff. Mile High on the left and the basketball court right in the middle, and then downtown just to the right. Urban design is really important, and parking sucks. And so, we want townhomes, or at least a building of this scale. Our idea and what the community had asked us for is let's touch the ground in a way that's not imposing or intimidating. We recognize there's a lot of density, but let's don't do it in a off-putting way. So on the street-facing side, we focused on townhomes as an expression, stoops, eyes on the street. Residents have access to the right of way, and kind of non-attached, attached living in a way. And you can kind of see the main residential entrance, and that big tall tower on the left is a stair tower, and we'll talk about that in a sec. We also want to break the massing of the building down, both from an inside out perspective. We wanted to make little micro neighborhoods inside of a double loaded building, corridor building. But also from the massing of the building, try to make it less imposing and box-like, and make it more like neighborhood scale and approachable relative to like the human body and the size of that. Same thing with the entrance. Entrances are really tricky, and they say a lot about an organization, how they're organized. Having an open entrance that's visually accessible. Like when you're approaching this lobby, you can look in. You don't have to wonder what's in there because you can see it. And it's just a vestibule and glass and non-intimidating entry sequence. You know, you either get buzzed in or call a friend or fob in. And the color temperature of the light is warm. The color temperature of the materials is warm. To the extent that we can do it, we like to use wood in lobbies, not metal or drywall. And you can see evidence of that here. This building has a lot of concrete and steel because of its size and kind of the code rules about that. But we tried to soften it with, you know, even the windows aren't hollow metal windows that are really easy to specify. We took the time to detail it in the old-fashioned way with wood trim and wood jambs and float glazing, and careful attention to lighting, and those big doors on the left, because we can't have the resident amenities in the first floor, as you'll see in a sec. It's on the third floor, so that stair is actually an egress core, but we open the doors up as big as possible so that people could see up and into the amenity room, and you can kind of see that door there at the top of the landing. Same idea, big doors there, and this stair has really cool views, and looking up, it's really cool. And this is the amenity room, and here we were able to go really crazy with wood, ceiling, structure, stuff like that, because we were into the code compliant zone of that. And then you can even see the way we structured seating was kind of like a playground, even though this isn't really a quote unquote playground. It's designed for kids to run around it and parents to be able to hang around in the loungy seating nearby, or have coffee, or read a book, or participate in community events. And we organize it in a racetrack. So, you know, a lot of times community kitchens are on a back wall and stuff like that. In this case, we put it in the middle so that there could be just this circular energy, imagining kids running around and doing what they do, and really encouraging that, as opposed to trying to contain it, which I have 3 kids. I know containing doesn't work all that great most of the time. Look at that, cute kids. You kind of see the bench on the back, and we kind of mess around with these mountains, and that came right from resident engagement. Like, you know, and that's a cool place to sidle in. You know, you can sit back there and look disaffected on a device and still be a part of a community, right? In the activities in the big room. And so we're always looking for those kind of sidle-on spaces. And in our research, we've kind of tended to call that nesting layers, where meaning, you know, there's layers of space where the central activity, and then you can imagine layers radiating off of that. Sun Valley also had an eco district and a healthy living initiative. And so this building was one of the first to be designed through that framework. And so we put together some diagrams talking about how the building promoted, you know, culturally based public art, or active stairs and daylighting, or social mixing. And so the level of intention, because of the length of engagement of DHA with these types of projects and the intentionality, was really high. So it was really fun to plug into that with kind of our framework around trauma, and plug into their process. Like I said earlier, parking's a drag, and urban infill sites are really hard with parking. So you can see there's like 3 rows of parking off of the alley, cloaked in the townhomes I showed you a picture of in our lobby. And then you can kind of see the stairs up to the amenity terrace. You know, first thing you see, kind of the welcoming thing you see. Then the amenity room opens onto the social and children amenity. This plan is also interesting because you can kind of see these clusters of 5 units. So there's 2 3-bedrooms on the south, 3 2-bedrooms on the north. The corridor widens in the center. And so the idea with this is that in a floor plate of 50 plus units, you know, we were trying to dissect the scale of the neighborhoods within a floor plate into 5, 6, 8 units. So the anonymity wasn't there, that the social accountability was started to be developed, and that relationships, meaningful relationships, could be formed. That's what the quarters look like inside. Each floor is kind of a different color palette. You know, normal units, giant units, 5-bedroom flats. Who does that? It's crazy. We worked with a playground manufacturer out of Canada called Earthscapes, and they worked with the kids in the neighborhood to design this box. You know, my first sketches were like of a dinosaur, and there's some topography to the terrace, the way it works. And that's going to be really cool to slide down the back of a dinosaur. But on retrospect and introspection and talking to kids, they decided the dinosaur wasn't really what they're into, but a fox cuddling on a little butterfly right there, way better. So I just accepted it and moved on. Really sweet. What I like about things like this is that we're going to buy playground equipment anyway. This wasn't a whole heck of a lot more, but now it's really embedded into the narrative of place and the community, and kids can climb on this and say, hey, I remember talking about that to the designers and working on that. And so it's an identity anchor. It's a thing that is kind of part of the neighborhood history now, and kids for all their life will kind of point to that fox and say, that's where I live, that's where I used to live, that's where I played with my friends. It's all kinds of cool in there. And I'll just wrap it up with, what we're looking for is to gain expertise from people with lived experience, whether it's shelter or housing or workplace ideas. The more we know and the less we assume, the better the outcome is going to be. And so taking the time really at the beginning to interrogate what's being said, what we assume, and ensuring that the assumptions start to give way to some research answers is really important. And when you do that, not only do you get to know your clientele better, but the quality of the outcomes are really, really very high. So I'll just leave you with this. This is our, we have this complement of propaganda out there. You can look it up if you want. And there's some webinars and stuff like that too. And I'd encourage you to check it out if this was interesting. It's kind of the tip of the iceberg, but it's like speed dating about housing.
I loved it. That was great. Thank you so much. Those were two fantastic presentations. And it was really great to see kind of both the planning process and how Julianna and her organization are really thinking about it and organizing with the residents, and then also how you all, Chad, did kind of the organizing with the residents to then really see how you both are putting that into policies and communication Candyland charts or play spaces that meet what people are really looking for. We have a lot of interest in the chat. I am going to just quickly pass it over to Julianna for 2 questions. We had questions about inclusive budgeting, and if you could provide any material or provide anything about that process or materials. And then we had a number of questions about your resident communications.
Yeah, awesome. I'll just try to address both really quickly. So great question about transparent budgeting. So I think one thing that we have learned is there can be one conversation around here's the whole budget and here's how it works. And as an educational tool, here's how the money works. And we recently did that with our resident advisory board, and that was really helpful from an information gathering or feedback gathering sort of perspective, just sort of here's how the money flows. And I think in a project, that conversation is really helpful, earlier stage, before decisions are being made and disrupting misinformation. There is a second type of conversation around actually making decisions about things that are going to happen based on budget constraints. I think one lesson there is packaging some options and saying okay, with this amount of dollars, we could do some kitchen and full bath, or with this, we could do full kitchen and some amenity areas, and putting those options in front of people and accepting that you'll probably land with another option that you hadn't constructed. But I think particularly when it comes to design and those kinds of decisions, putting it together for people, for residents was much more helpful than being here's all this money. What would you imagine seeing? That's not the stage that we're in. And also that's too big of a question. I have colleagues who do that, so I will ask them if they have resources. And Christina, I have your email, so I will see if there's anything we could email you. And then the written guidelines around communication has been really interesting. I'll say just to the process question, we put together a very, very small group to start of regional property supervisors. So people from property management who make decisions that actually impact how things happen in a lot of properties, and a couple of our staff in community impact. And we basically started to notice patterns in how we were kind of writing notices. We inventoried everything. Then we started writing. We're like, okay, we have a formula. So let's create the formula. Then let's take representative examples, and we brought them to our fellows, our resident fellows, and our resident advisory board, said, are we on the right track? And then we brought them to department heads in smaller chunks and said, hey, here's the stuff that impacts your department. Are we getting it right? So really breaking it down into little pieces. And then now it's sort of just getting like CEO sign off. But that, I think, going with a smaller group, then going to a lot of different people in small sets for feedback, I think was more useful. Hopefully that's helpful.
Great. And then I think you touched on this a little bit, but at the sites, who was involved in kind of tailoring that languages? Was that the resident staff, or was that really something that POAH was providing at the higher level?
Yeah, so we had property staff, kind of some property staff in the writing process, and then we would go to certain staff during, like, let's say there was a critical incident, we'd be like, we have this template, do you want to use this? Let's draft from there. And we were finding most of the time staff are like, please just tell me what to do. I'm already stressed out and thinking about a lot of other things. If you could take this thing off my plate, that would help. And so that would be mostly property management folks, but sometimes they're working in tandem with resident services based on whatever the follow-up is. But generally, like, it's not rocket science. It follows a format. It's like, here's what happened. Here's what we're doing. Here's what you can do. Here's when you'll hear more. And we found that people were usually actually trying, either they weren't saying anything or they were not communicating effectively. So we just tried to kind of break it down into a formula. And then we also did trauma-informed writing workshop for our services staff, which was also really helpful, which I can share with folks too.
Lovely. I'm going to fit one last question in here. There's a question about how much funding was dedicated to incentives for participation for things like the advisory groups, and has that been an important part to set up these feedback groups? And I think I'll open that up to both Julianna and Chad, because I know, Chad, you've engaged people, and so have you done any participation incentives?
Yeah, do you want to go first, Chad?
Sure, we always do participation incentives. A lot of our work is focused around homelessness, and so we like to do gift cards to Target or something like that, and exchange that for the expertise we receive. With staff in an agency, it's less of an issue. It's more we just kind of schedule the time, and it's part of their professional work. But in housing and homelessness, we always try to come with something along those lines.
Yeah, and in our toolkit, I think we listed the exact amounts for certain kinds of activities. And I want to say, like, if you did an interview with someone, that was $25. If you came to a focus group, that was like $50. So there's sort of like the kind of any kind of feedback, there's a compensation. And usually we do gift cards for those because it's like logistically, honestly, easier. But for things like an ambassador position or a fellowship, we're usually able to go up to $200 because that had historically been the amount at which it would not impact their rent. But that's changing. So that we might have to rethink that. And with our fellows, we gave them an option. You could do a gift card to a vendor of your choice, as long as like I could process it electronically, or PayPal, which was great. And we had a partner that did that for us. So PayPal was a great way to get people cash, because it was also the pandemic, people needed cash. And then there's this other interesting thing, like when we ask people to tell their story on camera or in front of an audience, that I basically say, name your price. And like some people, it's 50 to 100. I had someone ask for $1,500 and I was like, I have the grant money. I'm just going to give it to you because this is what your story is worth to you. So that I would treat a little bit separately. Like, I would be asking this person to go in public or to do something that will have their image and their story out there for a long time. So that one is like a little more like, what's it worth to you?
Great. That's great information. Oh my goodness, we are at time. I got caught up in the content. Thank you. Thank you so much to our speakers. This was amazing. I screen grabbed the picture of that adorable fox cuddling a butterfly. So cute. We are definitely going to need some follow-up conversations. So just letting you know, to everybody who is with us, you know, we'll be talking to Juliana about follow-up. I'll definitely grab all the emails who are interested in following up with Juliana and getting some more information. I put the link to the toolkit in the chat, but I also sent a follow-up email with the direct link and the link to some of Chad's materials as well. And we will make the recording available. So please look for a follow-up email. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We will certainly keep this conversation going.
Thanks so much to our presenters and for all of you for attending.
Thank you.